Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I just noticed that Errol Lewis is going to be very disappointed in me because I noticed there's no power broker over my shoulder. Often, if you see Errol, he sometimes has not one, but two copies of the power broker. I do love the book. Please don't hold it against me, Errol, if you're out there. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today to talk about what's a very prominent subject in the news right now, and one that has a resonance beyond New York City, but that Claudia did an incredible job of digging into in New York City. My name's Daryl Khan. I run the urban reporting program here at the J School. I was lucky enough to have Claudia as a student, and now it's always one of our great pleasures to then talk to them about great journalism they're doing out now as professionals. So Claudia, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll jump into it.
Cool. Thanks so much, Daryl. It's such a treat to be here and talking to you as a former student and as, of course, a huge booster of the J School. So my name is Claudia Irizarry Aponte. I graduated from the J School in 2018. I'm actually a graduate of the bilingual reporting program, the Spanish language reporting program, but I took all the urban reporting program credits. So I'm basically a graduate of both, even though my diploma only has one of the programs on it. I've been working at the city ever since I graduated. I joined the team in January 2019, probably about 3 or 4 months before the city launched. And I've been there ever since. I started off covering Brooklyn, which I did my first 2 years there. And then starting last year, I started covering the Bronx, which is the borough that I still cover to this day. I also cover a lot of, labor and the social safety net. It's a huge hobby of mine, but aside from that, it's pretty much all Bronx all the time.
Before we get going, I want to apologize to everybody in advance. I'm like suffering from serious allergies. And if I start coughing like a maniac, that's why I apologize. I also just we're going to jump into your story, but for the sake of clarity, and one thing you did in your story that makes me very proud is you took an opportunity, journalism, especially journalism around the law, politics, and government, should provide an opportunity for like a civics lesson, right, to the readers who might use words and throw some lingo around without understanding clearly what it means. So I wanted to take the opportunity right off the bat here to talk about how the New York City Police Department considers hate crimes, and then we'll get into, so everyone sort of has the context. According to nyc.gov, what is a hate crime? In accordance with the New York State, and I'll drop this in the comments later, in accordance with the New York State Penal Law, the New York City Police Department uses the following guideline, quote, a bias incident is any offense or unlawful act that is motivated in whole or substantial part by a person's, a group's, or a place's identification with a particular race, color, religion, ethnicity, gender, age, disability, ancestry, national origin, or sexual orientation, including gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender, as determined by the commanding officer of the hate crime task force. They go on to say, hate crimes go far beyond the criminal act itself. Becoming the victim of a crime is traumatic in itself. However, if the act was committed because of who you are and what you believe in, the violation is even more senseless and causes a deep emotional impact. All hate crimes are serious incidents and treated as such by the police department. Crimes that are motivated by hate are vigorously investigated by the hate crime task force. Okay, now I understand that what you ended up really digging into was that moment when what the police department investigates, right? They may arrest somebody, but what happens after that arrest can change significantly once they end up being handed over to the district attorneys, the 5 district attorneys that we have here in New York City. Do you want to talk a little bit about that process?
Sure. So what we found, when I say we, I'm talking about my colleague Yoav Gonen and I. He is a senior reporter at the City. This story was really his brainchild. We both worked on it together, but he received the data via public records request last spring, and we've been working hand in hand with this probably since like May or June 2021, and then we published our story in February. So it took several months. And what we found is that in New York City, most hate crime convictions are dropped. So say a person was assaulted on the subway or at a bus stop and someone called them a slur or said they were a Puerto Rican, this or that, the assailant in that case may have been convicted of assault or harassment or anything like that. But in many of these cases, the hate crime portion of that was either pleaded down or dropped entirely. And so, what hate crime convictions do in cases of assault is that they bump up the charges for assault. Say that it was a misdemeanor, and then there's a hate crime charge on top of that. If convicted of the hate crime from a misdemeanor, it goes into something one rung higher than that. And what we found is that most district attorneys' office, all of them really, in the majority of the cases, drop hate crime convictions, entirely. And the disparities vary wildly by office, whether it's Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Richmond County, which is Staten Island, or the Bronx. But the disparities are much worse in the Bronx. I have the numbers right here. And in the Bronx, only 1% of hate crime charges result in a conviction. That's, I believe, 1 out of every 92 cases in the last 5 years. And so we were really interested in digging into, number one, why, and answering that question in the story. Why does that happen? And also, what is the effect, of course, on the victims? Of course, we're at a point in our city's history and in our country's history, really, when hate crimes against, in particular, Asian Americans, because of COVID, are at an all-time high. The city is really at a point of great tension and sadness over repeated reports of assaults against Asian Americans, especially elderly Asian Americans, but against Jewish communities, and particularly Orthodox communities in Brooklyn. But of course, the cases that we saw kind of like ran the gamut of hate crimes against African communities, Asian communities, Latinos, Jews. And so we really just wanted to shine a light on these victims and see, is the system failing you? Is this, just asking that question in particular, how do you feel about the fact that hate crime convictions are dropped so often in the city? And what does justice look like to you in the meantime? And what we found is that for a lot of these victims, many of them didn't even know the outcome of their cases. They didn't even know that the hate crime convictions were dropped. And we can talk about that in a second, but I knocked the door on an elderly man here in the Bronx and not expecting him to. And at that point, I had knocked on so many doors and no one had gotten back to me. And the case had been settled 2 or 3 years prior. He had no idea that the hate crime conviction was dropped. And so just highlighting this great sense of frustration among victims while also highlighting the solutions, because this is clearly not working for anybody. And so, just how can we improve the system? How can we make this better for victims and survivors?
You have a great section. I've got 2 computers up here. I wanted just to read, because you very succinctly sort of summarized what the sentencing guidelines, the sort of consequences of the hate crime conviction. It says here, New York's law mandates a longer sentence upon a hate crime conviction by upping the offense 1 category so that a Class D felony becomes a Class C, boosting the range of the minimum and maximum sentences by several years. Additionally, a Class A misdemeanor, the top misdemeanor category, becomes a Class E felony, which is significant. The lowest felony category, when coupled with a hate crime conviction. For the most serious felonies, a hate crime designation lengthens the mandatory minimum, but not the maximum, which obviously in a case like murder where the maximum is already life, it makes sense. Just so we understand again what we're talking about, it's not like some people might think there's a law that is in and of itself a hate crime law. You see what I'm saying? Versus system that's in place to sort of raise the level of punishments for already existing laws that are motivated by, if it is found out to be through the police investigation, motivated by the broad class that we mentioned, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And can we talk a little bit about the genesis of this story? You said it almost took a year. I know working on a story for a year can be emotionally exhausting. Um, Talk to us a little bit about how you started and what some of the obstacles were that you encountered, and what were some of the things that surprised you as you were moving along.
Yeah, absolutely. So this all started with, again, my colleague Yoav Gonen submitted a public records request, I believe at some point in 2020, looking at hate crime convictions data. We received that data um, response. I believe it must have been May, like late May or early June last year. And I was brought in, right? It was a huge data dump. It was a 5 years worth of data. We had, to spend a few weeks, our data team scraping it and just looking over all the line notes and making sure that everything was okay and that our analysis was sound. And Yoav brought me in because we saw right away that the disparities, even though the hate crime convictions are dropped in the majority of the cases in all 5 district attorneys' offices, the disparities are even worse in the Bronx. So initially, we thought this was going to be a story focusing on why the Bronx district attorney's office very rarely, actually seeks convictions. We actually found that during the tenure of a Bronx district attorney, Darcel Clark, she hadn't reached a single hate crime conviction. The ones that we found were before her tenure started in 2017 or 2018, and our data was from 2015 to 2020. So we started looking into that, and the 2 main questions that we had was, why is this happening? Why aren't the district attorney's offices, in particular the Bronx DA's office, why aren't they, why are they dropping hate crime convictions? Number one. And number two, how do the victims feel about this? Do they even know that the district attorney's office are doing this? And if they do know the outcome of their case, are they satisfied with that outcome?
So let's
The
take the
problem
first part
is,
of that first. What was it like trying to once you got the data? What was it like trying to reach out to? I mean, I know it's a handful because you're not just dealing with one agency. You're dealing with 5 different
Mhm,
district attorneys' offices, each with their own sort of political
mhm,
kind of motivation and calculus they're making. So what was it like for you all to reach out to them, and did you have any luck?
mhm. I can't say that we did. I certainly reached out. Yoav and I, again, since we started just looking at the Bronx, we obtained the list of all the ADAs and the hate crimes unit and people who did research and all of that. And we reached out to every single person on that list. No one ever got back to us. It was a lot of, obtaining the list of ADAs at all 5 district attorneys' offices and reaching out to them, hoping that they would get back to us, looking at lawsuits, which in many cases, the ones that are posted online anyway, black out the information of the victims, including their full names. So even tracking down victims was an enormous challenge.
Mhm.
But the lawsuit includes the name of the ADA, the lawyer. So it was just a lot of pouring through the documents that are publicly available and part of our public records request, and trying to reach out to as many people as possible in hopes that they would get back to us. And we actually, the biggest break that we got actually was Yoav went up to at this point, we had decided that we're going to look at all 5 DA's offices. And Yoav spent a handful of days going to each courthouse and requesting the lawsuits, like the actual lawsuit documents, to get them because they were not available online. And the ones, so actually, let me take a couple steps back. So one thing that we started doing was we started looking for clips online because, of course, when there are several viral hate crime cases in all 5 boroughs. Of course, again, all the ones that I've mentioned against Asian Americans in the last 2 years, against Jews and the Orthodox community in particular, but against many others. I remember that there was this one case in the Bronx of this African, like Muslim African woman, a Black Muslim woman. who a group of teenagers targeted her on the subway, ripped off her headscarf, called her all sorts of names. And so that, in that case, I remember, was published in the Daily News and all of these things. But when we went to search her name in the public records, since those lawsuits are shielded or censored, we couldn't find them. So, but we did find the redacted versions, and so the description of that lawsuit matched what was described in the news articles. So we knew, okay, this must correspond to so and so. And so it was a matter of trying to reach out so and so, looking at LexisNexis, trying to get her to reach out to us, reaching out to their attorney, and then often the attorneys would, respond to us, choose not to talk, or say, listen, I'm going to defer to my client or former client. They wouldn't want to talk. They felt very strongly they just wanted to put the whole incident behind them. And so again, just to, we received a break, again, when Yoav just decided to go down to the courthouses one day, and lo and behold, he found the same documents that we had received in the redacted version, fully unredacted. He photocopied them. We had people's names, addresses, and the full unredacted reports. And then we started door knocking again. And that is how I met Arkelio Negron Rosa. He is the elderly Kingsbridge, the Kingsbridge senior that is featured in the story. He was attacked by a stranger waiting on the bus stop one day for his grandson, and had his shoulder permanently dislocated. Just a really awful incidence of assault. And his case is, and stop me if I'm blabbing too much, but his case is really emblematic of what we found, because it's a flashpoint of the victims not knowing how their cases ended up, whether or not they agree that the hate crime conviction was dropped, as was his case. And so they feel slighted by the criminal justice system. Like, I'm a victim, I testified in court, I spoke in front of a jury multiple times, and then you reach a decision in the case and you don't even tell me. Like, I have to find out from a reporter.
Right. I have this quote pulled up. I'll just read it for those, for people who are in attendance. Quote, I mean, imagine everything I went through. I went down to the courthouse like 6 times, spoke to lawyers, the prosecutors, and then with the pandemic, I had no idea what had even happened. And to think, that he, meaning the perpetrator, and others like him are out in the streets, he added. The city has to make sure these guys aren't out. The judges need to lock them up. Mm-hmm. So he obviously seems, he was caught by surprise.
Yeah.
By the disposition of his case, and it doesn't seem like that was something he had any input on.
Mm-hmm. And so he had a very strong reaction, which you see in that quote. It was very, very raw. But what he says later in another conversation, and I believe that is in the story as well, was that, he, agreed that this person needed help. What the perpetrator received in this case, he, was convicted of the assault charges. He was found, he had a very long rap sheet and known mental health issues, and he received counseling. They dropped the hate crime conviction on the grounds that he received counseling at an outpatient psychiatric program. And so he's out. He served jail time, but not prison time. And so what Arkelio told me, and what he's quoted as saying later in the story, is that he is fine with that outcome. Like, he said that he wanted this person to receive help. He just had no idea that he was out. And also just the fact that the case was settled like 3 years ago. And he says that no one reached out to him. No one told him about the outcome of the case. He found out when I knocked on his door. I was like, hey, remember that guy who pushed you down a flight of stairs? Well, this is what happened. Did you know about it? And he didn't. But his case is very emblematic of this issue, with the fact where you have the victim side, but also it's proof that hate crimes are extraordinarily difficult to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, because of the way the law is set up. And of course, you have the First Amendment of free speech in this country, however you want to swing it, unless someone, it's very hard to prove intent when someone assaults you and there's a hate crime component in this. In the case of Arkelio, this man pushed him down a flight of stairs because he asked to bum a cigarette. Arkelio said no. There was some sort of confrontation, and he shoved them down a flight of stairs. And forgive me for saying swear words, but he called them a Puerto Rican motherfucker. Like, that's what he said. He didn't use a slur, but then when he was arrested, he said something along the lines of, I don't want to speak out of turn, let me just pull up the quote, but he just said something like, I hate Puerto Ricans. It was something like that. And so that's how he was nabbed on the hate crime charge. But it's like, it's it's hard to prove when did he shove him down the stairs because he just wanted to or did he target him because of his race and ethnicity? That's very hard for a prosecution to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's one reason why hate crime convictions are dropped. And in a case like this, for a prosecutor, they're just looking to reach a conviction. They just want, to have some sort of resolution in the case. It's much easier to prove assault in a case like this than it is to prove a hate crime. So they plead down the cases, they nab the person on assault or murder or anything else. And then the case is settled and the DA can say that they won this case. So there's that tension between, what justice looks like for victims, if they even want to pursue hate crime charges in the first place, if they actually believe that this person should be locked up away forever, or if the perpetrator needs help, versus how the way the law is written and the burden of proof required in cases like this.
One story I remember from he died recently, sadly. Kevin Chadorowski was worked for DCPI when I was covering the police department for Newsday, and he was on the hate crimes task force. And one story he used to tell whenever one of these cases would come up and we'd start talking to him or the department about this issue would be when he got a call one night to go out to Borough Park, and he literally had to look at a pattern that was peed into the snow in someone's yard and figure out whether or not it was a swastika or not.
Mm-hmm.
That was like, it's like, what am I supposed to do with that?
Mm-hmm.
He went, he tried, but I think it speaks to what you're saying, which is, and one of your sources even mentions, if two neighbors are having a fight over a parking space, right? And they start getting heated, are they really, is the fight over the parking space and they're throwing some heated language around because they're in the moment? Or was the fight motivated by a bias or some hatred, right?
Mm-hmm.
And having to, rely on law enforcement to sort of make that distinction can be difficult or, ambiguous at best, right?
Mm-hmm. And then there was another case that has been pretty fraught also in the Bronx. I believe this was last summer or last fall, a very fraught situation in Riverdale where several synagogues were targeted in just what looked like random attacks, windows smashed. I believe it was either a swastika or like the N-word were scrawled in a playground nearby, obviously caused a lot of outrage in the community. Eventually, the person was caught on camera. That case has not really been settled yet. But again, these are people with like real mental health issues. These are cases where, a community, one could say, was targeted because it was several, at least geographically, at least he targeted several synagogues within a community. But then for someone who has, a long history of mental health issues, it's easy for a prosecutor to be able to nab this guy on vandalism, less so to be able to say, this was a targeted hate crime. His intent was to cause harm in the Jewish community in Riverdale, all of these things. We saw so many cases in Brooklyn several years ago, the game where like young people would smash people at the top of their head, and there were reports that they were targeting the Orthodox community. It becomes fraught when you're talking about especially young people, and a community that's been acted upon themselves, Black youth. It becomes a very fraught discussion. And so from the perspective of the prosecutor, it's easier to prove the assault than the intent to cause harm, to not to cause harm, but the targeting of someone because of their race, ethnicity, religion, etc. So that's why many of these cases are so difficult to prove.
Yeah, I mean, and you bring up, I think, one of the most central points about this discussion, which I think is sort of glazed over. There's, I think, a sense that, like, the instinct when you hear hate crime, it summons up images of America's very dark past, right? We see crosses burning on a front yard, right? Somebody leaving a noose somewhere, these very kind of powerful things. What you look at in New York City, and I spoke to a few people in law enforcement that I've known for a while and trust, you know, and you broach the subject in your story. So much of what ends up getting the arrests that are made are people who are homeless and often mentally ill, or if not completely homeless, then not securely housed, right? And a lot of law enforcement will say those folks sort of obsess over politics and conspiracies and race, right, and religion. So, in some ways, the hate crime phenomenon is a mental health issue, which makes it really more frustrating to know that the governor had an opportunity, to put $500 million into a group in New York City of mental health advocates and declined. But what do you think about that? Is that something you found in your reporting, that, in many cases, trying to fix this mental health crisis would, in many ways, it wouldn't solve the problem, but it would go a very long way in ameliorating a lot of these hate crimes?
Mhm. So that's a wonderful question. Yoav and I felt very strongly that we didn't want this story to become kind of like a reactionary thing where it's like, oh, we just need to throw the book at these folks who do hate crimes. Like that's the solution here. The city has to lock more people up. We really wanted to highlight all different perspectives here and all different realities here, frankly, especially as we talk about a larger conversation in this country about how we handle crime and policing. The idea that arresting people based on hate crimes or assault or murder, does that really have an effect on hate crimes declining or assaults going down or murders going down? And so we talked to numerous experts here on both sides of the aisle, from people, former prosecutors, current prosecutors, different district attorneys' offices, and justice advocates, and even advocates who serve these communities, like the Asian American Foundation, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And what we came back with from our conversations was an enormous sense of frustration from pretty much everyone involved. This sense of kind of like, if not hopelessness, then perhaps impotence, that like just the current system is not working. The majority of hate crimes don't lead to a conviction. Meanwhile, whether or not they lead to a conviction or not, the victims feel like they're not getting justice. And of course, we're talking about, and a lot of politicians have a lot of tough talk, especially in the last 2 years, in the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, about really again, throwing the book at these folks and like arresting everybody. But has that really had an effect in acts of hate going down? That's a lot more difficult to prove, and preliminary data shows that that is not the case. And so how do you square that? Where do you move on from that? For us, it was very important to highlight solutions and to talk about the grassroots efforts of and work of a lot of advocacy group and people who work in these communities. And we got two main takeaways. Number one, from the grassroots side, the importance of not just teaching vulnerable communities how to physically defend themselves, but also involving just the entire population, and like identifying and de-escalating situations that are volatile and may lead to hate or maybe something physical. The Asian American Foundation and others lead free de-escalation trainings. They have been successful in at least people just feeling safer, like Asians feeling safer, or just anyone who's targeted feeling safer. If like, okay, if someone starts yelling at me or if I don't feel safe, this is how I know I need to respond. But also putting the onus on bystanders and bystander intervention, not just entirely on the victims and people being targeted. And another main takeaway was that there's an enormous desire for reform of this system. And when we talk about hate crimes in particular, very strong desire for law enforcement to have the victim's best interests at heart and to involve them at every stage of the process, not just, and to making sure that situations like the one with Arkelio, where a final decision was issued on his case and he was none the wiser for several years, to make sure that that never ever happens, to make sure, of course, that interviews and all stages of the investigation are trauma informed, and people don't have to, confront and have to go over their trauma assault over and over again, only to, reach whatever decision needs to be reached. And one final note that I will say is that, again, of the victims that we spoke to, a lot of them also, like, some of them felt like, yes, let's lock away the guy who did this to me forever. But others felt like this person needs help. Like they want the solutions to also be, how, not just how can we prevent these crimes from happening, but also how can we get these folks, especially as you mentioned, that many of the perpetrators here are homeless, in and out of homeless shelters, or have, severe mental disabilities or any other challenges. How can they get the help they need? Like that, how do we address that root cause to make sure they don't harm more people? And there's a sense that this all has to be part of the conversation. And again, this is all part of a larger conversation in the city and in this country about how we handle crime and policing.
Right, right. I'm just trying to keep an eye on here. I wanted to make sure that we got a chance to talk, because some of the people in our audience are going to be doing stories like this soon enough. Can you talk a little bit about what your strategy was, sort of in the nitty gritty, from inside the newsroom, right? You all do this great work. You sort of got this great pile of information. Now, what is your strategy for attacking it? Like, why did you ever consider thinking about, because I still can't help myself. I'm constantly editing copy while I read it. It's a disease. But I thought, you started your lead, went in a different. It could have very easily. And I was wondering if this is something you considered, going with the incident, with your victim, your lead victim, or was that something you never considered, and just what your thought process was in going into writing the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Writing, I can just start with the end and writing the story itself, and then I can just go back to how we reported it out. Yoav and I probably spent maybe 2 weeks writing the story. It took a really long time. There was a lot of material that didn't make the cut because we had so much there. And this is easily the lengthiest story we've done at the city in terms of word count, which is not something that we ordinarily do. And again, there was a lot that was cut out, so it was initially even longer than that. And I believe one of the early versions of the story did have an anecdotal lead, leading off with Arkelio. But again, since this was such a hard news story, especially with everything going on, we wanted to be able to state the facts starting off, and then flesh out, victims' experiences, the solutions, and just organizing it that way. But it's funny you mentioned that, because I think the earliest version of the story had an anecdotal leading with Arkelio. And so again, the actual reporting process took many months. Yoav received this FOIL request back late last spring. It was May or June, I really don't remember. And first we spent several days and weeks, our data team, scraping the data, making sense of it. And Yoav and I initially wanted to do a story that focused purely on the Bronx DA's office. And eventually, since it was proving so difficult to talk to people there, we figured if we broadened it, and it was certainly newsworthy because the disparities are present in every single DA's office, it would have been unfair to single out the Bronx, even though the disparities are higher there. And so we broadened it that way. So again, it was, I don't know how he did it, but he obtained the list of all the hate crime unit ADAs in the Bronx, reaching out to those people. It was, again, just a lot of obtaining bits and pieces of lists of names and informations and lawsuits and complaints, some of them redacted, some of them unredacted, and reaching out to dozens of people in the hopes that they would get back to us, all while working on other things. We weren't working on just this one story for the last 10 months. So it was, perhaps it would have been faster. We would have been able to nail it faster if we had 6 months to just work on this one thing. But it was, balancing working on this long-term story while doing all of our other beat coverage. So it was a lot of that. And again, there was this enormous break, like in January, when y'all finally was like, I'm just gonna go down to the courthouse and see what I can find. And lo and behold, he found the unredacted, the same lawsuits that he had received in a public records request, but unredacted with the victim's full name and addresses. Started knocking on doors. And the first person who got back to us was Arkelio. I knocked on his door probably in late January, early February. It was probably like late January. And he welcomed me into his home right away, which is a great feeling when you're a journalist. Like, you go in expecting to really having to convince people to talk, to come forward. But he was so, outraged at the fact that this is how he found out about the outcome of his case. It also helped that I'm also Puerto Rican. So when I knocked on his door, I just spoke in Spanish and he just welcomed me in his house right away. There was no, there was no language barrier or cultural barrier there. And we're very grateful to him because he was very generous with our time. We visited him at his home multiple times. He was very detailed.
Can you talk a little bit about, did you call first, or would you do cold knock on his door?
I think I just knocked on his door. I didn't have his phone number.
Was he there the first time? Was he at home the first time?
Luckily, he was there the first time. And then the documents that we had several different apartment numbers in that same building. Mm-hmm. And luckily, the first one that I tried was the one that he lived in. And he was at home with his wife, and he just welcomed me in right away. It was like journalism lottery. Because there were several other people that we had door knocked, and they didn't live at that address anymore, or they weren't home. And he was like the first one that it was like, okay, boom, there he is. And he wants to talk to us. Great. That was kind of like how that worked out. And the reporting really sped up from there, because at that point we had the data, we had the experts, we had, the several DA's offices were cooperating with us, because of course we then gave them our data, like our findings. Can you verify this? Or these the same numbers you have? So at that point we had the district attorney's offices, in particular the Bronx one, cooperating with us already. All we needed were victims, were people who could speak about their experience. And so that was another big break in our reporting. And then the story came out maybe a month later.
And how many people who were hate crime victims were you able to even, I know you just mentioned that there was a bunch of people, like they're in the wind, the addresses are old, and that's a common problem. How many people were you able to get all together, do you think, to even make contact with? And of those, how many people were willing to, let you in and talk a little bit, even on or off the record, about what happened?
People that we reached out to, I would say about a dozen. And then people that got back to us, it was probably less than 5.
Wow.
It was a very small amount of people. It was very challenging to talk to victims. It was the most challenging part of the story. Because again, for the documents that we found that were unredacted, a lot of them had, they had moved out, the phone number was wrong, or they did not use that number anymore. Right. They didn't live in New York anymore. They didn't respond at the addresses that we were able to door knock. It was extraordinarily difficult, especially because a lot of these cases were several years old. So we had no way of, like, we knocked on every address that we got a hold of, but I can speak personally of 2 cases that I remember where someone actually answered the door. They had no idea who I was talking about and claimed that that person did not live at that address anymore. Gotcha. So yeah, it was by far the most challenging part of the story, talking to victims. I think that's probably the main reason why it took so long, was encouraging people to talk to us and finding them in the first place.
I saw in your story that there was sort of basically a no comment from the perpetrator in the case that you focus on. Was there any attempt to reach him personally or to see what had been happening in the intervening years? Was he still in that program, or do you know, or was he already gone through? Because I know you mentioned that there was like an alcohol program that the Bronx DA diverted him to.
So according to the Bronx DA's office, he successfully completed that program. Again, unfortunately, since we're talking about a person who is in and out of homelessness and in and out of the system, finding addresses for this population is incredibly tricky. So we were not able to reach out to him directly. We did reach out to his attorney, and I believe that's the no comment that you are referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you, before I'm going to turn it over to questions here pretty soon, but did you walk away from this story with feeling a little bit differently than maybe you had before you started? Were there any sort of assumptions or thoughts that you had about hate crimes that your reporting sort of changed at all?
I was certainly surprised at kind of like the double talk from a lot of elected officials. There's a lot of tough talk, especially in the last 2 years, and even from the DA's offices themselves, of, again, just throwing the book at these types of crimes. Like, we're really going to crack down on hate crimes. And then seeing that squared with the numbers was very sobering. I think whether or not you're the reporter looking at this, like, it is such a stark contrast. And I learned a whole lot about why exactly this is so difficult to prove. But more than my main takeaway was, talking to the victims. There were several people that I spoke to who didn't make the cut in this story, whose assaults were very recent. And so it was a lot of raw emotion. And then for us, it was a matter of not capitalizing that or seizing on that. These are people who are processing a deeply traumatic experience in real time, who probably haven't even made up their minds about what justice looks like for them. It changes by the day. But our main takeaway, and something that I hope shines through in the story, is a really strong desire for change. You think when you talk about victims of hate crimes that they very strongly want, as victims, for this person to be locked away forever. And no, like that, Arkeli is a perfect example. His raw reaction to me telling him the outcome of his case was to say, like, oh, the city has to lock up away these people forever. This is ridiculous. I'm leaving New York. Who can live like this? And then it was like, maybe, again, we were in contact with him for several weeks. As he's reflecting on it, he was like, no, like, I agree that he needs help, but the city did not handle this correctly. The DA's, like, I like he said, I went to court like 6 times. I spoke to numerous attorneys. I was in the hospital. I went to the police precinct that day. I identified him at lineup. Like, I put in all this emotional labor. Like, when we talk about emotional labor, I invested so much of my time and efforts in this, and then to not, and the DA denies us, but he says that to not even have the courtesy of being informed of the outcome of the case, or the knowledge that this guy is out there already, was really sad for him. And so there's a very strong desire from the victims and from advocates to change that part of the process and to make it very much more victim centered.
I thought this was a great quote that you had in the story that gets to your point about sort of the grandstanding that the politicians do, right? You say, a fellow from John Jay College says, if you're a politician, if you're a councilman, if you're a representative of a certain community, you better darn well speak in a way that's going to sound like you're going to protect that community. But the language of protecting a community and the difficulty of proving this case are two very different things. And I think, you did a great job. I mean, that's where we come in, right? The politicians are going to run their mouth about some things. Law enforcement's going to say something else, right? But you did a really good job of sort of understanding that there is a gap between those two things, between the rhetoric that's said and the reality of having to go and make a case. Let's see, what do we have here? I'm more than happy to, Jen, if you're out there, to turn it over to questions.
Yep, I think we can go ahead and start questions now. The first question is from Julia, and And she asks, when you're conducting a journalistic investigation, what are your early steps to gather info, but also avoid letting the subject know they're being investigated by a journalistic team?
Okay. Are you referring to kind of like the top bottom source of like the DA's office, or kind of like the bottom up, like the victims and things like that? I can answer either. I
Well, yeah, I
guess.
mean, I would say that
Yeah.
there is no, I mean, the short answer is that we don't avoid letting them know. Right?
Yeah,
I mean,
we don't. Oh, I see that Julia wrote in the chat. She was talking about DAs. We like there's no way for us to avoid letting them know, and it's better to let them know on the outset, and to be honest at every step of the reporting process. I'm sure the DAs, we probably started reaching out once Joab obtained that list of ADAs, and we already had, you know, that initial like raw data scrape. As soon as we started reaching out to people in the DA's office must have found out right away that we were working on this. Of course, we knew from the beginning this was going to be a project that was going to take a really long time. So we made every effort to be discreet. We didn't reach out to people at their official .gov email addresses. We reached out to people on Facebook, LinkedIn, things like that, encouraging them to speak on background or anonymously, or just share any sort of information that could be useful. But of course, like once you reach out to staffers or former staffers, it's safe to assume that the higher ups know that you're looking into this. And as I said, this took several months. And once we had our data was kind of like finalized, we reached out, Yoav and I reached out to the DA's offices pretty early, like maybe like a week before our deadline, if not earlier than that, because we already had comments from several DAs telling them, so this is the data we have. Does this match with what you have? If not, why? Show us what you got. Let's talk about this. But like, we're doing the story. And so that's one way to do that. And then with the victims, it's the same thing. As soon as you reach out to someone, you know, of course, you make every effort to like do a clip search and like be educated about their situation before you reach out to them. But yeah, it's the short answer is that they always know, I think.
yeah, I mean, I would just add to that you know, the cases that I can think of are incredibly rare, where, you know, you're protecting a source and you're protecting that source from either violent retribution or criminal retribution. But in almost any case, you know, you go out of your way to sort of say, hey, just to let you know, we're doing this, we're doing, we're going to be talking to you're probably going to hear, we're going to talk to former officials, or, they're probably going to give you a call and let you know.
Yeah. And I think in this case, it's safe to say that that they knew that we were as soon as we submitted the FOIL request, as soon as y'all submitted the FOIL request, they knew that we were looking into this. We requested the data. Right. So they may have not known what we were working on or what our intentions were, but they knew that we were looking at them.
Right.
So,
right. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to go to the next question from Joseph. When Daryl read the description of hate crimes, this part stuck out. As determined by the commanding officer of the hate crime task force. This made me curious about how this is made and what is the criteria to make it. What about this issue sparked your curiosity? And also, what is that criteria? Is it taught by the DOJ or some other entity? Is there a task force per borough or one for the whole city?
That is such an excellent question. I feel like that alone could be its own story. I don't have the answers to all of your questions, but yes, like the officer has the discretion to determine what is a hate crime. Who exactly or what agency exactly prepares the language or the criteria for the officer to evaluate? I assume it's the NYPD.
Well,
it could be
it's right. The law was passed in 2000 and signed into law by a Republican governor at the time, right? And in the federalist system that we occupy, the DOJ has very little to say about how each of the 18-some thousand law enforcement entities that exist in the United States, because it's up to them. They're the local government. They make those decisions. The NYPD, obviously, as sort of the gold standard in police departments in the country, and one that sort of sets the tone for what other smaller police departments might do, that might have some bearing. But I mean, the language is taken from the law, and as to, you know, the hate crime task force is a citywide task force that has investigators spread throughout the. It's a detective bureau, and they have investigators spread throughout the city. But yeah, I mean, anything shy of the Department of Justice investigating a department for some kind of real malfeasance around how they're, right, if they're only prosecuting one group for hate crimes, then it seems obvious that it's out of some kind of political motivation or something. It would take something really onerous for the DOJ to come and sort of, otherwise they're not going to tell the no one tells the NYPD what to do.
Yeah, it's all very much left to the local jurisdictions and the district attorney's offices. Yeah, absolutely. And then as far as a definition goes, it's a definition that Daryl read at the beginning of our conversation, and it's exactly why it's so difficult to prove, because it's up to the commanding officer, I forget the exact title, to decide. And again, the burden of proof is really, really high. It's not just, and of course that's up for a prosecutor and for a jury to decide if it fits the bill. But many police officers are hesitant to even, cite someone up for a hate crime unless they use a slur, or, the person states during their arrest or at any stage of the assault, like, oh, like, I hate Puerto Ricans, or like, or whatever. Or like such and such group deserves to die. Like, it's very difficult to prove in that case. So they usually look for that language in order to even issue the charge.
Right. And you mentioned even looking at old posts, but even that that's not a slam dunk either. Just because you posted or wrote things online, it doesn't necessarily mean that was what was in your mind at the time of committing the crime, right? I'm going to drop this in to the comments, to the chat.
I'll go ahead and get the next question started. Has COVID contributed to hate crime convictions in any way?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Has COVID contributed to hate crime convictions in any way?
To hate crime convictions, I wish I knew the answer to that, but unfortunately the data that we have is as of 2020. We do not have 2021 and 22 data yet. But certainly preliminary data shows that hate crimes have unfortunately increased since the pandemic. Most incidents, of course, against Asian Americans, or people perceived to be Asian American. But it's too early, unfortunately, to have actual conviction data for the period since the pandemic began.
Great, thank you. And the next question, do victims feel let down or discouraged when they see they don't make the cut, or do they understand and appreciate the attention you gave?
When they don't make the cut in a story?
Yeah, I think that's what they're asking.
Yeah, I think in general, when someone that I spoke to doesn't make the cut, especially when they're a victim or just kind of like a lay person, if you will, like not a politician or something, I like to, of course, as soon as I interview them, thank them for talking to me. And then once the story is published, I like to send it to every person that I spoke to. And if they don't make the cut, I just tell them, hey, I really appreciate you talking to me. Your story didn't, or your incident or your quote didn't make the final cut, but I really appreciate you talking to me anyway. And most of the time they just say thank you. I don't think I've ever had an incident where someone was like, particularly a lay person who, put a lot on the line to talk to you in the first place, are crabby about not being in an article. So, and that was not the case here either. So. Yeah.
I noticed, I think it's gone now, but somebody who had a question said that the threshold seems very high. It is part of the reason there has been a critique of getting rid of hate crimes entirely, because they are so hard to prove, right? And then sometimes they become borderline thought crimes if you give the state too much power in investigating motivations. There's no way to have the way there's something like a drug or alcohol court, right? There isn't really a hate crime or a hate court that can divert people to. That doesn't exist, and I can't ever imagine it existing. And finally, when you give the state power, they tend to expand it and hold on to it, right, and use it. And there's no telling who will be in power at any given time, who will expand what's on that list, who will lean on people to encourage the heads of their police departments or law enforcement agencies maybe to really push hard for one kind of hate crime and maybe look the other way on another one. A very clear example of this was two of my students were interns for me at the time who were covered the protests around the death of Alton Sterling, who was shot by police in 2016. There was a peaceful protest. There was a fairly violent police response to the peaceful protest. And in the wake of that kerfuffle, the governor expanded hate crime laws to include police officers. So that means, right, we often, again, we think, oh, it's going to protect people who need protecting. But in this case, that means a peaceful protester could go from getting a desk appearance ticket to maybe spending time in jail, right? Because they said something which would be free speech, free protected speech during free protected assembly, right? And now because they said, whatever they said or had their poster that was critical, they could say, all right, well, now you're not just getting a ticket for stepping onto the street, you're going to get a year in prison for, this hate crime. So it's something to think about. I know even it's sort of, I think most people think of this usually as an issue around Democrats. But it was a Democrat who in Louisiana who expanded the law, and it was a Republican in New York who created them. So it's an interesting point. Claudia, do you have any closing thoughts? I know we're wrapping up here.
Not really, but thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, man. Great piece of reporting, and congratulations on your nomination.
Oh, thank you.
Award. We're all
thank
very
you.
proud.
And thanks everyone for your wonderful questions.
Yeah, and I think, Jen, everyone's got my email. If they have any follow-up questions, they can feel free to send them my way. I'll be happy to answer them.
And I'll send an email to everyone who signed up with the recording. And thank you all so much for coming. This was excellent.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks, Claudia.